Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 135 of Experience Data Talk podcast and video show featuring data science leaders and technologists from around the world. My name is Mike Delgado, and today we're excited to chat with Morgan Klaus Scheuerman about ways computers see gender and the implications for those with marginalized identities. Morgan is an information science PhD student exploring the ways individuals with diverse gender identities interact with technology. He's also a research intern focused on ethical artificial intelligence at Google. Here's our conversation. Well, Morgan, thank you so much for being on Data Talk.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So you have an absolutely fascinating background, and I was looking at your LinkedIn profile, and I saw that right now you're currently working on your PhD in information science at University of Colorado. But I noticed that your undergraduate work, when you originally went into college, you focused on communications. And I was wondering if you could talk about that, because I found that very fascinating. I also focused on humanities early in my academic career. And I love chatting with people who kind of pivoted into information sciences, data, with a humanities background.
Yeah, I feel like my background is just kind of all over the place because even before then I was doing photography. I was like very convinced that I really wanted to go into the arts. I wanted to be a photographer. And so actually this kind of led me to in a way because I thought, oh, maybe I could get into a career of photojournalism or something like that. And so that's why I started out in comm. But when I was in undergrad, I feel like I took a breadth of classes. So I became interested in other things because of that, I guess. I started taking a lot of women and gender sexuality classes. Those really interested me a lot. And then I also took some interesting kind of internet studies courses and like internet policy and platform policy courses that really made me realize that like HCI and information science was a thing, because this was not something that I knew existed going into college. And so it was really kind of a discovery avenue for me.
Yeah, and it's interesting because like typically you don't even like see those types of classes in the humanities area.
Yeah, I don't know much detail as to like why my college specifically offered that.
Yeah.
I don't know if it was the professor that really was interested in those things or not, because I also took classes in more traditional media analysis. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know what drove me to take that class, but we started reading like Dana Boyd and people like that. And so that's why I was like, oh, you could do research on how people interact with this technology. And so that's kind of where I became interested in it and why I went to grad school.
That's so cool. Yeah, Dana Boyd is like a hero of mine. I remember studied her. I was in a graduate school program in 2008, and I remember reading one of her papers on MySpace, because MySpace was huge at the time. And there was this quote from the student that she interviewed who said, like, if you're not on MySpace, you don't exist. I still remember that paper that she wrote.
Yeah, I guess it's changed a lot, but it's still true of other platforms now.
You got interested in information policy and were in a humanities program. You finished that, and I noticed that you didn't take a break. You went right into graduate school.
I did, yes. This was kind of a mix of things. I felt like the opportunities I'd gotten with my undergraduate degree and just like what I'd done with it in terms of internships, etc., was really pointing me towards a career in marketing and advertising. And that was just not something that I was interested in doing. Although I did get an opportunity because I'd interned with this like tech digital startup where I was doing digital marketing. I did get an opportunity to talk to people who worked in user experience, which again was something I didn't actually know existed when I was in undergrad. And I talked to one colleague there who had gone to University of Maryland, Baltimore County for the human-centered computing program. And so that's where I kind of got this idea, this inspiration to go to grad school and try that out, because it seemed much more interesting and much more human focused than, I mean, I guess one could argue that marketing is human focused, but the outcomes and the goals are much different than user experience design. And so that's why I went straight into grad school. And I initially went into grad school thinking, oh, I want to be a practitioner. I want to be a user experience designer. I want to work on, prototyping platforms or prototyping interfaces. And yet again, I found that, oh, I actually really like this research thing. I think I would rather do that. And so, so I got into research kind of like as an apprentice, I guess, with my advisor at the time, Stacy Branham. She's at UC Irvine now. But this is also what inspired me to go on and do a PhD because it's not. I never had thought I would do a PhD in my life. I'm also a first generation college student. So from undergrad all the way, like, yeah, no one in my family has gone through undergrad either. So it definitely wasn't a path that I saw. So it kind of just feel like it fell together for me.
That's beautiful. Were you encouraged at all in your journey? Like when you were in high school, did anybody talk to you about going to college and kind of pursuing that route?
I mean, I think there was a little bit. I mean, when I was in high school, maybe it was becoming a norm to go to college, and I spent a really, really long time actually at community college because I didn't know what to do, and I feel like I wasn't discouraged, but I didn't feel like I had a lot of guidance on what I could do. So I spent a very long time in community college just kind of floundering. Yeah, it definitely wasn't something that I really thought through very much back then.
Well, it's also difficult because I remember I was the same way. Like when I finished high school, I wasn't quite sure what to do. And this is back in the 90s. So like back then, filmmaking was huge and I was really into film and television. So I really wanted to like become a filmmaker. This is back when like Quentin Tarantino and like independent filmmaking was kind of like booming. And so back then I was like, well, there's no college classes for this. So I went to like a local community college and started taking like television film. And it wasn't until like later on that one of my friends, a mentor, like told me like, if you really want to be a filmmaker, you need to learn storytelling, which means you need to study English literature. And so that was actually what pushed me to like actually get a degree and pursue English lit. But I feel the same way, like, especially early on when you first are in high school or just graduating, sometimes you don't even know what major to choose.
Yeah, definitely. And honestly, for me, I was terrible in high school. I hated it so much. I hated school. I don't find it particularly embarrassing so much as like illuminating to say that I wanted to drop out of high school. Like I just really wasn't interested in anything. And I definitely didn't picture myself going on to be in school for God 20 years. But yeah, I mean, I think that's something I don't know if I've told many people that. I don't know if it's ever really come up, but like I just had no drive in high school to really pursue academics, which is kind of the opposite, I think, of what people think of me now. But yeah.
And I have a lot of friends who also, like in high school, they didn't enjoy themselves and they couldn't wait to get out. And it wasn't until later that they got passionate about a certain field and then went all in like you are.
Yeah, I definitely relate to this as well. Totally.
When you go, I don't know too much about PhD programs, but when you go in, do you have to have like a thesis in mind, a project in mind?
I mean, not necessarily, and I think this differs per discipline probably. I personally had really strong feelings about what kind of research I wanted to do, and so that was helpful for me, particularly in narrowing down the places that I actually wanted to go. But a lot of people, they don't necessarily know exactly what they want to do, or they have general interests, but they haven't really done research in the past. I don't think it's super common for a master's student to have done much research or publish much research before going into a PhD program. So yeah, it really ranges in terms of experiences.
What advice do you have for those who are looking to pursue a PhD program? What advice do you have as far as like researching the right program and then also kind of the application process?
Well, I think I have some advice that's typical of most advice you would get, which is to really look for your advisory fit. That's kind of like the first level of advice a lot of people get. Like make sure the fit that you have with your advisor is really good. So whether that's your rapport or that person is in a research area that you want to do, because that person is going to be who you're spending like 5+ years with. And if your research interests don't align, it's rather hard, I would think, to research only things that you're not super interested in. So that's like a number one thing. For me, actually, I didn't listen to some advice. So some people say don't choose to go to a place that you would want to live, simply because if you want to go into academia afterwards as like a career, often the universities that you go to aren't going to hire you as a professor.
Mm. Oh,
So
interesting.
the idea is that, you go someplace and you leave in 5-ish years. But for me, actually, where I live really matters. Like mental, again, like mental health is really important to me. And feeling, I don't know, like also the community. I think here I really love the information science community. The other students are amazing. I feel like I have a tight knit kind of circle of support, and so that's really important too.
So, what was it about the advisory fit at University of Colorado Boulder?
So I work with Professor Jed Brubaker, and he runs the identity lab. So that's like kind of already in name rather perfect for my research on identity in, machine learning and algorithms and things like that. But something that I really appreciated was that it felt like he would give me the freedom to explore questions that I cared about. This wasn't necessarily that something that I think was always true of every potential advisor that I talked to. So for me, that was really important because I kind of had really strong opinions about, I want to pursue research on like gender and other complex identities in technical systems. And a lot of I didn't think that there were that many people doing, I guess you could call it social sciencey or humanities, like interpretivist kind of research on algorithms that I knew of. And so I think this also gave me the opportunity to kind of delve into a space that is now starting to expand much more rapidly than, 3 years ago, or I guess even 5 years ago when I first entered my master's program.
Yeah, I was looking back and we've done over 130 episodes of Data Talk, and we've never covered gender before. Never came up. We covered like technology, the business side, a little bit of race, but never covered gender. And so when I saw some of your research published, I was looking forward to chatting with you because this is a field that I'm like, I feel bad that we haven't covered it here.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is something that hasn't been largely examined. I think it's also has a lot to do with, if you view gender as kind of a more of this constructionist type of view, you have this kind of viewpoint. I mean, it's not the most well established field. I mean, I guess you could assume it would fall under feminist theory or queer theory or one of those humanities disciplines, but I think within those disciplines, it hasn't reached quite as far as data and other forms of technology most of the time. Even when I was doing my master's, there were really only a couple researchers in this general human computer interaction space who were researching gendered experiences on like social media. So that was kind of like to me, a groundbreaking thing because I hadn't really seen that much of it. And I know there's been a lot more of it since. But yeah, in terms of data, I think gender has been talked about a little bit less, but there is like a rich, rich quote unquote kind of history of gender being used in algorithms, usually as this kind of binary input output. But in terms of like really analyzing that from a critical perspective, it's less common.
What led you to zero in how algorithms, how computers are determining genders, which largely is based on what people have written into code?
Yeah, I guess this is another one of those kind of like puzzle pieces falling together stories. So when I was in my master's, Stacey Branham, who I'd mentioned, she really researches accessibility work. And so I became kind of like a master's student apprentice on other PhD students' accessibility research.
Oh.
And so we happened to do this one project, or I was apprenticing on this one project with them, and it was about how people who are blind or have visual impairments might benefit from visual information about people for the sake of safety. And so things started to come up like wanting to know the gender of the person who is, walking towards you on a dark street to make a decision about whether you feel safe or not safe. And so this kind of had me questioning, maybe because I'd taken so many queer theory classes or other classes in my undergrad.
Yeah.
Well, what does this mean for another kind of marginalized population Like if we think about their perspective on being gendered potentially. And so this is what I did my master's thesis work on, was kind of, this general overarching perspective on safety when it comes to digital technology, but also like, how do you weight the safety of different groups, or what does that look like for certain populations? And so that's why I got really interested in that, and knew that I wanted to pursue that into my PhD. But again, it wasn't something that I came in thinking about into my master's program. It was an accumulation of like other experiences I'd had, and in a specific moment, I think, that really led me to that.
And it must be hard because when you're entering, well, I mean, what's exciting about it is working on something that really hasn't been written about. It's somewhat new, like you're entering into new territory, which is exciting. At the same time, it's extremely challenging that you don't have a lot of other data points to point back to.
Yeah, I think it was, particularly at the time. I mean, I was also just learning how to even do research, let alone how to write a research paper. Like all of that was a challenge already. And yes, a lot of what you learn too about research is like, well, how are you building on what already exists? And I have learned since to become quite creative about making those connections. So although maybe this one specific analysis of gender doesn't exist in this one specific scenario, there have been very interesting analyses of gender in other contexts. So something like social media is a great place to jump off of. It's like people have analyzed why back in the day Facebook only allowed male or female, and people have analyzed kind of like real name policies and things that are tied to gender on social media platforms. And so that's a great jumping off point to ask, well, what if we now ask these questions of machine learning algorithms? And so now that's become, I think, less of a challenge for me. And also more people are doing this kind of work. It's more critical of the categories themselves. And so I think that also is great because I'm meeting more people too that are interested in these things.
I mean, you're in an area that's it's so complex. There's so many components to it. And so it's awesome that you are going down this path and studying it and looking at all the different perspectives on this. And you're right, like computers back in the day, especially Facebook, you have two gender options. And it's great to see today, like you don't have to assign a gender to yourself. So it's great to see the progress that's being made. But yeah, you're entering into just like this very complex area. And so it's awesome that you are like helping to lead the discussion here.
Yeah, it's super interesting and also in many ways challenging, because I'd say like human computer interaction as a field, or information science as a field, has adopted this kind of mixed methods and multiple ways of viewing the world for the most part, like as a discipline. You see many different types of research and many different types of approaches in our conferences and journals, but machine learning is quite different, I would say. It's a much more, I think, insular and disciplined discipline. So there's very particular ways of viewing things in machine learning and ways that research is legitimate. And so that has been a little bit of a challenge, is people that are trained in machine learning based computer science, like people who do PhDs in AI and things like that, don't necessarily buy into or want to collaborate on these things. And so that is a little bit of a challenge. And I would say it's not entirely true of everyone, because in machine learning, fairness and accountability as this new kind of subfield is also a lot of computer scientists who are trained in computer science who are now kind of questioning the social implications of their training. But most of the field remains rather technocratic or theoretical mathematically, I guess would be a better way. I think those are kind of two perspectives that are common. And so, yeah, I would say that part is a challenge. Is like, well, I don't want to just critique another discipline. I actually want to collaborate and change and try to think of ways to solve really socially complex problems, or reimagine what the model could look like. And so that, I think, is actually the biggest hurdle for me, is just the disciplines don't tend to see things in the same way.
And I think also, like, there's an art to this. Like, it's not just the math. Like, a huge part of this is being creative. Like, how do we assemble this?
Yeah, I think there's actually a lot of really interesting opportunities. I mean, the space is very fraught too with, if it's applicable to a real life problem, it becomes quickly potentially unethical. And this is kind of an issue with machine learning generally, is that you can kind of create something with the most creative or benign idea, but how it becomes adopted, or how the next person goes and builds off that research is kind of often falls into these places of not being super ethical, depending on your perspective. I know like surveillance and policing are major areas for machine learning, right? So, but otherwise, I actually think there are a lot of really interesting and cool ways of rethinking just like what is how do we categorize the world? Because that's what a lot of particularly in computer vision is doing, categorizing the world in certain ways to teach quote unquote a computer to make those predictions. And so it would be interesting to see machine learning researchers or work with machine learning researchers who want to adopt a view that's beyond this kind of like naturalism that isn't, I don't know, I don't even know if they're necessarily trained as computer scientists to buy into like naturalism and medicalism, but it is commonly something that happens. I feel like as a bit of an outsider, it's hard for me to determine exactly why that is. Like why does the computer scientist then adopt kind of this actually rather older view of medical biological science? Not 100% sure. But yeah, I think there is a lot of art to it, but the way that it's taught and disciplined and the research that's being done is it leans really into like positivism, I think, and legitimizing things through this is the way the world actually is. We aren't being creative, we're being objective.
Yeah, that's right. I'm going to link to your articles on our blog, but I'm curious about like the reception of some of your work.
So the last one I wrote was how we teach computers to see identity, or title, but so I was looking how we've taught algorithms to see identity. So that one's actually about race and gender categories in the data. But previously, I think the paper that people are more familiar with is how we've taught computers to see gender, or how computers see gender. And that was kind of an audit of commercial gender classification systems. So like Microsoft, IBM, et cetera. And these have changed so much within the last 2 years, which is really interesting how fast paced this field is. You know, like IBM, I don't know, I haven't checked if they still offer an analysis model. I know they don't offer like facial recognition anymore. Google has gotten rid of all of their gender labels, but it's definitely been an interesting, I think there's a mixed reception to this paper. I think the HCI community, I think really liked it. I mean, we got a best paper award, so we've gotten like really great reception from them. I think generally the people who are in fairness and accountability, FATE as they call it, also great reception, but the people who are really hard-lined machine learning, you cannot prove that an algorithm is wrong because it can't, like based on the things it can't do, I don't think that they appreciate it very much. I mean, I've had some like interesting and frustrating conversations and it almost feels like starting from ground zero for me in terms of gender, where I mean, I'm sure machine learning people who are trying to explain a model to like someone who's totally unfamiliar probably get frustrated as well. I wouldn't say I'm totally unfamiliar, but I'm trying to relate. But definitely like starting from, well, here is also like my, worldview, my epistemological way of approaching things. And this is why it doesn't align with the way that you believe the system should be critiqued. And I've had these conversations with people, and I constantly point to Philip Eger's critical technical practice paper. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. He got his PhD in AI at MIT, and he wrote this kind of paper essay, scathing review, if you will, back in the late 90s about the epistemology of machine learning and how the only way to critique machine learning is rather insular. So you either build a better model or you critique it within the constraints that the model exists already. And so in terms of gender, that would be, you can't really critique the fact that it can't classify a non-binary person. You can't say that that's inaccurate mathematically because it was never designed to do that. But rhetorically, you can critique it, right? And so there's this kind of a misalignment between rhetoric, social construction, and mathematics or statistics that I keep running into with some people. And it's funny to me because, Eger wrote this piece in the late 90s and it still hasn't really changed. It's still the same in terms of, well, either build a better thing that works for the application you care about or critique it within the constraints that it exists. And I just don't think that those are necessarily the best ways of critiquing them, nor the most realistic for our social world.
Yeah. Oh man. Did you feel putting out that paper, did you feel stressed out?
I did not, but I also I didn't expect people to really engage with it that much. So I wasn't really thinking about it at the time. I mean, it's so funny because I'd had calls even with some of the companies that we analyzed, and I never would have expected that. So I definitely didn't feel stressed because I was like, oh, the only people who are going to read this are like HCI people. I definitely didn't think that I would have any kind of confrontation with someone over.
Have like data scientists like reached out to you, like those who like really want to understand, like want to do a better job around how they're working with gender identities?
Yeah, actually. So I've been doing this kind of slow collaborative work with some people at Google on, if we want to use this for a specific use case, which is like analyzing bias, for example, in the media, how can we conceptualize gender in a useful way for that problem that isn't super exclusive or exclusionary? So I definitely have talked with people who are, we've implemented this and we've actually used it to analyze bias in the media, but we want to do it in a more inclusive way or rethink, what can be done. And so I think there are a lot of open-minded people, data scientists, who are interested in this problem because it's also like a challenge for them, I think. So yeah, I mean, it definitely hasn't I don't want to stereotype all of the machine learning or data scientist people I've come into contact with because it's not true. There's just been like a couple of particularly unreceptive people who may be a little more vocal, but generally the response has been very positive, and I think it's opened a lot of doors. We have some great new undergrads in the lab who are super interested in and are now working on new research projects in this area. So it's been great in terms of starting up collaborations and conversations.
That's awesome. I'm glad to hear that. And I'm glad to hear people are reaching out, asking questions, wanting to be thoughtful, showing some empathy on trying to deal with this because it is so complex. And it's awesome that you're like kind of opening up the doorway for like, let's have these discussions. Let's talk about this. How can we do this better?
Yeah, I mean, that's generally the goal. I mean, it's definitely something that there are a lot of critiques to be made, but I think the harder thing is actually to move forward in some meaningful way, because I think, regardless of what your opinions are on something like facial analysis technology or facial recognition, particularly, that's a fraught area, right? A lot of people want this technology gone, but to do that, you kind of have to move forward in some way with people, policymakers, data scientists who have some authority in the area, right? So for me, I think being open to those conversations is actually really helpful towards meeting whatever goal you have as either a researcher or an activist or whatever your role is. And also to establish more ideas about that area, more creative ideas, because it's hard to, like I've said, a lot of what I've done has been in some way inspired by some other thing that I've done, like some other collaboration that I've done. And so really having a lot of people to talk with is really helpful to move forward in some way.
So like you've been writing on this topic. Have you like figured out like your current thesis, like what you're going to be writing about?
I mean, not solidly. So next year I need to do that. But I do have a number of related projects that I want to work on. So I can imagine an overarching theme of, how are identity aspects, social identity aspects treated as an infrastructure in different kind of levels of a system. So, I've analyzed like what the outputs are in terms of, prediction scores, and I've analyzed what the data is, but there are other aspects to that. There's almost like a human level of infrastructure, like who is making the decision to include what and how in a system. How is annotation done, and what do annotators bring to the table? These are all questions that I'm really interested in.
And I wanted to ask you too, I saw on your website you have the HCI guidelines for gender equity and inclusivity, which is fantastic. How did that project come together?
So this was at a conference that we submitted a workshop to. So we wanted this workshop to host this workshop on, how to write about gender inclusively and kind of like how do we build up a guidelines for this? But actually that workshop was rejected from the conference. We actually wound up holding an informal workshop at the conference that was not like, if you're interested in this, come and we're going to brainstorm. And so we brainstormed a bunch of different areas for like, with the people who came, which was great. It was like 20 people. It was still a lot of people on, what areas are missing? Like, what should people know if they're trying to write or do research on different populations? And then from there, we just kind of committed to using that information and collaborating with the people who came on writing some informal document, because it's not, it's just on my website. It's not published anywhere. And again, this is one of those things that I didn't expect to be as utilized as it is. And to the point that it's gotten rather funny, to the point that like I'll be submitting like an article and they'll be like, you need to read these guidelines. And I'm like, I am the person who like authored those guidelines. So yeah, it's gotten really amusing in some ways, but again, it's like one of those things that are just like, okay, we're gonna do this, and if people use it, they use it, and they just happen to.
Well, it's fantastic. It's such a useful guide, and like I was reading through it and I was realizing my mistakes that I've been making, and particularly around misgendering. Like just recently, we were passing around resumes at work, and as I was like describing different interviews with people, I was using pronouns, and I was just assigning pronouns, assuming totally misgendering. And so like your guidelines was like such a, like I'm like I need to read this regularly, and it's super helpful. So thank you for developing it.
Yeah, I'm so glad it's useful, because I mean it was also written with the idea of writing in mind, but I think a lot of people have used it for other things, even just like education. I've had people reach out to me and say, they've used it in classes, which is really cool. So I'm glad that it's like applicable to many different life scenarios.
Yeah, totally. Like I'm thinking like I'm like reviewing my emails, like blogs. I'm like, I've done a horrible job at this. So like your guidelines are super helpful for me to be more thoughtful and have more empathy when I'm developing content. So Morgan, thank you so much for being on Data Talk. For those that want to learn more, what's the best way for them to follow you?
I think Twitter, maybe. That's probably, in terms of social media, I am the most active on Twitter.
Okay.
I don't know if it's helpful for me to state my handle though, but
well, what I'll do is I'll put it all on the Experian blog, and I'll have links to your LinkedIn account so they can follow you there, as well as your Twitter account.
Cool, yeah. It's so funny. LinkedIn is not something that I even think about, actually. I like never update LinkedIn at all, and so sometimes I'll go in and I'll have like messages from people, and I'm like, oh god, I haven't been on LinkedIn in like months.
Okay, I gotta remember that. Thank you so much for being on Data Talk, Morgan.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Data Talk podcast. We share new shows every week, and you can find the full catalog of previous episodes, including YouTube videos, on our Experian news blog. You can get access to the full catalog by going to experian.com/datatalk. And we always love hearing from our community, so if you have any comments or suggestions for future shows or guests you'd like to hear from, please let us know. You can leave a comment on iTunes, or you can reach out to us on Twitter @Experian Data Lab. You can also email me directly. My email is michael.delgado@experian.com. Take care, and we'll chat next week.